He hadn't said a word, hadn't stepped past the lobby doors, when the CEO pointed at him and barked, "Security, get him out. This isn't a shelter." He was black, he was quiet, he was dressed too simply, and that was all it took. In a building that worshipped power, they stripped him of worth before he even spoke. No one asked why he was there. They just assumed he wasn't. But what if the man they humiliated in front of the whole company was the only one in that room with the power to tear it all down? This isn't just a story about arrogance. It's about the moment prejudice shakes hands with karma and gets crushed in its grip. You're not ready for what happens next. Tell us, where are you watching from? What moment made your jaw drop? Drop a comment, hit like if this hit you, and subscribe, because this isn't a story. It's a reckoning. The lobby of Carradine Group's headquarters pulsed with the controlled energy of power. The kind of space that whispered wealth through polished stone floors, soft jazz from ceiling speakers, and the practiced efficiency of receptionists who never broke their smile. Executives in designer suits walked with purpose, phones glued to their ears, while visitors were ushered by security with crisp coordination. Into this world walked Malcolm Thorne. He wasn't flashy. No designer cufflinks, no personal assistant flanking his side. Just a man in a deep gray tailored suit, well fitted, but not brand name recognizable. He carried a slim black folder under one arm, his steps unhurried, yet filled with quiet certainty. His presence was unassuming, but still somehow drew attention, for better or worse. Sterling Huxley stood near the central glass staircase, surrounded by his usual orbit of investors and board members, laughing like the room belonged to him. He had the build of a man who played golf competitively and a jawline that hadn't cracked a genuine smile in a decade. Every word he spoke came with a price tag. Every glance he threw was loaded. That glance found Malcolm. Sterling's voice, smooth as polished steel, sliced through his conversation. "Someone lose a delivery guy?" he asked loudly, drawing chuckles from his circle. His eyes locked on Malcolm with a gleam of superiority. Or is FedEx letting their employees wear suits now? Malcolm didn't flinch. He simply walked up to the reception desk and gave his name. "Malcolm Thorne. I'm here for a 10:30 with Human Capital and Strategic Operations." The receptionist, clearly startled, checked the screen. Then her eyes widened. "Yes, of course. You're expected. I'll notify them." But Sterling was already moving toward him. "You've got to be kidding me," he murmured, brushing past a junior associate. "Hey, you need directions? Security's down that hall." "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Malcolm replied evenly. Sterling stepped into his space, his smile just tight enough to be insulting. "Uh-huh. And I'm the Queen of England. Look, I'm not sure who let you through the front door, but this level isn't for visitors. Or interviews. Unless you're joining maintenance." His audience behind him was eating it up. Two whispered to each other. Another chuckled and turned away to check his phone. It wasn't subtle. Malcolm calmly opened his folder and handed the receptionist a printed appointment confirmation, complete with company seal and VP signature. Sterling snatched it. "What's this?" "Microsoft Word Special," he scoffed. But then he paused. The signature was real. So was the invite. He handed it back, like it had burned him. "Fine," he muttered, stepping aside. "They're experimenting with diversity hires, I guess. Don't get your hopes up, though." Malcolm didn't answer. He walked past him with the same quiet grace, heading toward the gold elevators. A junior assistant, nervous, moved to catch up and guide him to the proper floor. Sterling turned back to his group. This is what happens when HR starts pulling names out of a social justice raffle. Laughter followed. One of them shook his head, half grinning. "You're terrible." But not one of them objected. At that moment, from the mezzanine balcony above, the company's executive coordinator for talent acquisition leaned slightly over the glass, having seen the entire interaction. Her lips pressed together in thought. She quietly pulled out her phone and sent a message. "He's here. And it's already begun." Back on the main floor, Malcolm stood inside the elevator. The doors closed with a whisper. He stared at the polished brass, jaw clenched, but said nothing. Malcolm Thorne stepped out of the elevator onto the 31st floor, where the executive briefing room sat encased in glass and steel, a cathedral of corporate power designed to impress and intimidate. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Junior executives, senior analysts, and department heads milled around under the soft light of modern chandeliers, sipping artisan espresso and murmuring about the mystery strategist the board had brought in for the fiscal realignment. No one expected the man, now calmly approaching the glass doors. Malcolm walked in, shoulders squared, folder still tucked under his arm. The silence was immediate, a ripple of surprise disrupting the steady hum of conversation. Eyes turned. Some widened. A few glanced instinctively towards Sterling Huxley, who had just entered moments earlier with his entourage, still chuckling from whatever demeaning joke he'd last delivered. Sterling's eyes locked on Malcolm across the room, and without missing a beat, he smirked. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, loud enough to draw everyone's attention, "please welcome today's guest speaker, brought to you by affirmative action and lowered standards." A few people gave tight, awkward chuckles. Others looked away, visibly uncomfortable. Malcolm said nothing. He merely made his way to the seat prepared for him near the presentation screens. Sterling wasn't finished. He stepped closer, his voice dipping just enough to feign intimacy while making sure everyone still heard. "I noticed your hands shaking downstairs," he said, circling Malcolm like a shark sizing up prey. "Cold? Or something more clinical?" He offered a smile as thin as glass. "You're not hiding early Parkinson's, are you?" he added with faux concern, drawing a few gasps and a nervous laugh from someone in the back. "I mean, in this business, one tremor in judgment and you collapse markets." Malcolm met his gaze evenly. "Some tremors are caused by pressure," he said calmly. "Others by rot beneath the surface." Sterling blinked, taken aback for a split second before masking it with a laugh. "Oh, I like this one," he said to his group. "Philosopher vibes. Very Ivy League dropout energy." Then louder, addressing the room again, "Let's just hope he can get through his proposal without passing out, or what's the term, short-circuiting." The insult landed like a slap. Malcolm could feel eyes on him, not all malicious, but hesitant, unsure, afraid to intervene. He noticed one woman, a senior financial planner he recognized from past reports, subtly glance away in shame. Sterling, pleased with the unease he'd sown, turned to grab a coffee from the side counter. "Hazelnut," he said to the intern manning the refreshments. "Not that weak stuff you give middle management." Then, sipping his cup, he looked back at Malcolm. "So what's your big idea, Thorne? Going to teach us how to invest in inner-city crypto funds?" The room gave a hollow chuckle, not at the joke, but at the pressure to react. Malcolm remained still, expression unreadable. He hadn't come here to match Sterling's venom. Not yet. His time was coming. Just then, the doors opened and a photographer stepped in, followed by a communications rep from the board. "Pictures for the quarterly release," she announced. "Let's get a few candid shots of our leadership and today's special guest." Sterling didn't hesitate. He strode across the room, wrapped an arm around Malcolm's shoulder like an old friend, and beamed at the camera. "Smile," he muttered through clenched teeth, "or they'll think we don't get along." The photographer snapped 2 shots. Malcolm didn't move, his jaw tight, his eyes cold. Sterling dropped his arm and whispered, "Don't worry, we'll crop you out before press time." The session began, and Sterling made a point of dominating the first 15 minutes, interrupting others, tossing sarcastic quips whenever Malcolm tried to speak. "Interesting perspective," he'd say, "though I'm not sure if it's relevant to real market conditions." Or worse, "Well, you're entitled to your opinion, even if it's, let's say, unconventional." Malcolm responded professionally each time, never once matching the hostility. But inside, he was tallying every word, every smirk, every humiliation. And so were others. When the meeting broke for coffee again, Sterling passed by Malcolm's seat, leaned close, and whispered, "If you're smart, you'll keep your mouth shut during the final review. The board doesn't like experiments that talk too much." As he walked off, Malcolm turned to the empty notepad before him and began to write. Sterling Huxley didn't waste the momentum he'd built from the earlier humiliation. In his mind, The room had shifted into the palm of his hand, the way it always did when he leaned into arrogance laced with charm. He stood at the front of the room, holding court like a king overseeing jesters, his designer suit catching the downlights as he grinned. The presentation was meant to move into its second phase, scenario modeling, but Sterling had other plans. "Let's make things interesting," he announced to the crowd, his voice warm, playful, but with an unmistakable undertone of mischief. "We have a guest today, don't we?" His eyes swept across the room and landed on Malcolm. "Mr. Thorne, how about you walk us through a real-time pitch? Something off-script. Show us what you've got when the safety net's gone." The board's advisor glanced up, mildly surprised, but said nothing. Others turned toward Malcolm with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Malcolm looked up from his notes. "That wasn't part of the agenda," he said evenly. "Oh, come on," Sterling replied with a wide smile. "We're all professionals here. Think of it as a test. I mean, if we're trusting you with high-level strategy, surely you can handle 5 minutes on your feet." The room buzzed, no one daring to interrupt. Malcolm knew what this was. It wasn't a professional opportunity. It was a setup. But he rose anyway, buttoned his jacket, and walked calmly toward the front. Sterling stepped aside theatrically, offering the floor with an exaggerated bow. "Ladies and gentlemen, the man of the hour," he declared, prompting a few forced chuckles from the back. Malcolm turned to face the room, and for a brief moment, the atmosphere shifted. He stood straight, eyes level, shoulders relaxed. "Let's talk about leverage," he began, voice steady. "Not just financial, but systemic. The way organizations consolidate influence, not by merit, but by legacy access." "Wait," Sterling interrupted, waving a hand. "I said pitch, not politics. This isn't a TED Talk." The interruption drew uncertain laughter. Malcolm didn't flinch. "If you're asking me to present without context," he said, "then let me make one thing clear. Numbers don't exist in a vacuum. Strategy without awareness of bias is just expensive guesswork." Sterling's jaw tightened slightly. "You're getting awfully philosophical again, Malcolm. Let's talk dollars and cents. Pretend you're in a boardroom that actually matters." Malcolm tilted his head. "Are you saying this one doesn't?" The room caught the jab, and for the first time, a few smiles weren't directed at Sterling. The CEO didn't appreciate that. With the grace of a snake shifting its coil, he turned to the building's AV tech. "Cue slide 32, the one with the lost projections," he barked. "Let's have him walk through that. See if Theory Boy can do math under pressure." The screen flicked to a complex financial breakdown. Sterling didn't give Malcolm time to adjust. "Okay, hotshot. Read the room. What's your move?" Malcolm calmly stepped forward, scanning the screen. "I'd restructure asset classes under hedge-insulated instruments, diversify your bond exposure, and trim Tier 3 overweights." The room went silent. The accuracy was surgical. Sterling's face twitched. He couldn't let it sit. "Sure," Sterling said, recovering. "Smart on paper. But theory doesn't mean execution." He turned to security, nodded subtly. "We've heard enough. Let's clear the stage." The two security officers near the side doors didn't hesitate. One stepped forward. "Sir, we'll need you to return to your seat." Malcolm looked at them, then at Sterling. "This is unnecessary." Sterling grinned like a man who'd already won. "We just wanted a taste." "We got it." As the guards approached, Sterling raised his voice so everyone could hear. "You see, folks, this is a perfect case study in optics versus reality. Just because someone walks like a strategist, talks like a strategist, doesn't make him one. You need more than a suit to play this game." A few in the crowd laughed, nervously, guiltily. Others remained frozen. The two guards flanked Malcolm but didn't touch him, clearly uneasy. "Gentlemen," Malcolm said quietly, "step aside. I can walk on my own." They parted just enough for him to pass. The room had begun to settle again after Sterling's staged humiliation, but Malcolm's composure still lingered in the air like an aftershock, quietly unsettling. Several executives whispered among themselves, their expressions unreadable, while others avoided eye contact altogether. Sterling, however, couldn't stand the lingering trace of dignity Malcolm had managed to retain. That quiet, unshakable calm, it mocked him more than any comeback. So, he decided to take it further. He needed to tear Malcolm apart, not just in front of the crowd, but intellectually, surgically. And he knew just how to do it. As the group transitioned into the private Q&A that followed the presentation block, Sterling leaned against the edge of a long oak table at the center of the room and tapped a pen sharply against its surface. "Before we break for lunch," he said casually, "let's do something different." "Malcolm," he didn't say Mr. "Thorne, you said earlier that strategy without awareness is expensive guesswork. That's a clever phrase. Now tell me, what exactly qualifies you to say that?" Malcolm raised his gaze, eyes steady. "My record," he replied. 15 years restructuring distressed assets across 3 continents. Recovery rates of 19% above industry benchmark. I've led due diligence teams, advised regulators, and managed fiscal pivots through volatile cycles. That qualifies me." Sterling let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as if amused by a child's confidence. "And your education?" he asked, lifting his eyebrows. "Let me guess. One of those online MBAs? Or maybe just a few Coursera certificates and a dream?" The jab drew a few snickers from the outer circle. Malcolm's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained level. "Yale School of Management. Class of '06. Cum laude." Sterling clapped slowly, mock applause echoing through the room. "Bravo," he said. "So you've got the paper. But paper doesn't mean poise. And from what I saw earlier," he gestured vaguely at Malcolm's hand, "you were shaking like a leaf. Public speaking nerves? Or something more permanent?" The implication was cruel, cutting directly into the vulnerability Sterling had observed earlier and deliberately saved for this moment. "Perhaps neurological," he continued, lowering his voice to faux concern. "I mean, no offense, but if your hand can't hold still, how can your mind?" A chill swept the room, but no one spoke. Malcolm straightened in his chair. "Essential tremor. Diagnosed in my early 30s. Non-degenerative. Doesn't impair cognitive function, decision-making, or my ability to outperform half the people in this room." Sterling nodded with an exaggerated expression of understanding, then turned to the board's HR director. "Well, that's a relief, isn't it?" he said, voice thick with sarcasm. "We wouldn't want someone unstable, physically or mentally, holding fiscal power, now would we?" The HR director shifted uncomfortably but didn't respond. Sterling wasn't done. "Out of curiosity," he asked, tilting his head at Malcolm, "how do you even manage paperwork? I assume typing's okay, but do you sign documents or do you just get someone else to hold the pen steady?" That broke something. Not in Malcolm, but in the room. One of the junior strategists, a woman named Kara, who had sat silent until now, muttered, "Jesus Christ," under her breath. Sterling turned sharply. "Something to say?" Kara stared at him. "You're humiliating him. This isn't a Q&A. It's a slow-motion mugging." Sterling's grin faltered for the first time. "I'm assessing talent," he snapped. "We're about to entrust millions to an outside operator. If he can't take the heat, you're not testing his logic," Kara interrupted. "You're testing his dignity. And failing your own." The room went quiet. Sterling looked around, searching for backup, but found none. The momentum had shifted. Still, he forced a thin smile and returned his attention to Malcolm, as if trying to reclaim control. "I suppose I hit a nerve," he said smoothly. "Didn't mean to rattle your fans." Malcolm stood, slowly. He adjusted the sleeves of his suit with deliberate precision, his hands steady now, almost eerily so. "Let me answer your question directly," he said, voice low but resonant. "Yes, my hand trembles, and I won't apologize for it. But if you think that makes me unqualified, unfit, or undeserving of this seat, then the only thing shaking here is your grasp on what leadership really looks like." The silence was heavy. No claps, no laughter, just the heavy weight of a room suddenly ashamed of itself. He couldn't allow that room to remember Malcolm as composed, articulate, or worse, dignified. He needed to humiliate him again, not with logic or critique, but by stripping away civility, by turning respect into ridicule. It was nearly noon when Sterling cornered Malcolm again, this time in the executive lounge. a sprawling space lined with minimalist furniture, espresso machines imported from Milan, and a panoramic view of Manhattan that seemed to say you belong here only if you earned it. Malcolm sat alone by the window, reading a company dossier, eyes moving steadily across lines of financial notes, unaware that Sterling was already watching him from the drink station. There was no audience this time, just a few lingering staff, and one junior consultant pretending to scroll on his phone. Sterling moved like a hunter who knew the terrain. He grabbed 2 cups, one a pristine ceramic mug with the carradine crest, the other a stained plastic one often used by the janitorial staff left behind in the wrong bin. Without a word, he walked over, placed the dirty cup in front of Malcolm, and held up the clean one for himself. "I figured this one suits you better," he said, smiling. A little humble energy for a humble role. Malcolm looked at the cup. It had a coffee ring around the rim and a faint crack near the base. He said nothing at first. Sterling sat opposite him, sipping smugly from his own cup. "What's the matter?" he asked, tone syrupy. "Too used to boardroom service now? Or maybe it's the sanitation department vibes that feel too familiar." Malcolm closed the dossier, folded his hands atop it, and looked directly at Sterling. "Did you need something?" he asked, voice calm but devoid of tolerance. Sterling laughed, loud enough for heads to turn. "I needed to check if that suit came with a spine," he said. "Because back there in the meeting room, you almost convinced me you belonged." Almost. Malcolm didn't respond. He simply pushed the plastic cup aside with 2 fingers, careful not to spill it. Sterling's smile twisted. "You know what I hate most about people like you," he continued, leaning in. "You dress up like professionals, you speak with polish, you flash credentials. But at the end of the day, it's costume play. You're imitating power, but you'll never own it." The words came sharp, deliberate. Sterling wasn't even hiding the venom anymore. "You're kind," he began, but Malcolm interrupted. "You mean my kind? As in people who weren't born in your zip code, didn't inherit a last name with equity, and still managed to get here on merit?" Sterling paused. For the briefest second, something flickered in his eyes. Not fear, but exposure. Malcolm went on. "I've worked on 3 continents, built turnarounds for companies 10 times the size of this one, managed markets you've only read about. I've been denied rooms like this my entire life. And I walked in anyway. I'm not pretending to be powerful. I am powerful. You're the one pretending. Pretending insults make you relevant. That should have ended it." But Sterling wasn't finished. He leaned back, nodded to the intern at the far end of the lounge. "Hey, do me a favor," he said. "When the janitor comes in, make sure he knows not to throw out that suit by mistake." A few heads turned. The intern froze. Even the coffee machine seemed to fall silent. Malcolm stood, picked up the plastic cup, and walked it slowly to the bin. He placed it inside without a word, then returned, lifted the pristine carradine mug off Sterling's side, and poured its contents into the sink. "You're right about one thing," he said, eyes fixed on Sterling. "This does belong in the trash." Sterling's smirk collapsed. He stood abruptly, chest puffed, but before he could speak, Malcolm stepped closer. "You think humiliation is power," Malcolm said, voice just above a whisper. "But it's not. It's weakness dressed as dominance. You confuse cruelty with strength. And one day, when no one laughs anymore, you'll realize you were never respected, only feared. And fear doesn't last." Malcolm stood inside, alone, his folders still clutched tightly in his hand, his reflection in the mirrored walls looking back at him with eyes that had grown colder since morning. Moments earlier, he had stood toe-to-toe with Sterling Huxley in the executive lounge, refusing to swallow humiliation disguised as corporate culture. But now hours of subtle and overt aggression were catching up with him, dragging behind his ribcage like iron weights. As the elevator doors opened into the marble and glass atrium, Malcolm's phone buzzed. A message from Sterling's assistant, short and purposefully vague. "Mr. Huxley has requested that you wait outside while we confirm logistics for the investor lunch. It won't be long." That was nearly 2 hours ago. Now Malcolm sat on a hard stone bench outside the company's entrance plaza, wind pushing against the collar of his coat, the late autumn chill crawling under his skin like judgment. He didn't pace. He didn't fidget. He simply waited, posture composed, but eyes hollowing out minute by minute. He had texted no one, called no one. The silence around him was a choice, but that didn't make it less deafening. Passers-by came and went, interns, consultants, senior VPs, all of them casting passing glances at him, some curious, most indifferent. He saw it in their eyes. They didn't know who he was, or maybe they'd already decided. A man in a nice suit sitting alone on a stone bench, folder in his lap, hands occasionally trembling as he pressed his palms together to keep warm. And the worst part? He didn't even blame them. The narrative had been crafted for them, by Sterling, by the dismissive glances, by every unanswered message that came cloaked as procedure. He thought about getting up, about walking away, about calling the car and never stepping foot in that building again. But that would be surrender. And surrender meant giving Sterling exactly what he wanted. Silence without resistance. So he waited, until the lobby doors finally hissed open and Sterling strolled out, jacket thrown over one shoulder like a Wall Street cowboy, phone in hand, a pair of expensive sunglasses perched casually in his hair. He stopped when he saw Malcolm, eyes widening in mock surprise. "You're still here," he said, voice pitching just enough for people nearby to hear. "Damn, I thought you got the hint hours ago." Malcolm said nothing. His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't stand. Sterling stepped closer, looming. "Come on, Malcolm," he continued, smirking. "I figured a guy like you would be used to being rescheduled. Or rejected. I mean, let's be honest, you've probably been told wait outside your whole life." His tone dipped into venom, sweetened by a fake laugh. "And honestly, 2 hours of fresh air can only help with those nerves of yours. Maybe loosen up the shakes, huh?" Malcolm's fingers curled slightly around the folder's spine, knuckles whitening, not from rage, but restraint. There were no cameras, no board members, no audience. Just him and a man determined to crush him in isolation. Sterling wasn't testing resolve anymore. He was trying to break it. "Tell you what," Sterling added, checking his phone like he hadn't just spent the morning orchestrating emotional warfare. "We're wrapping early today. Lunch got canceled. Investors pulled out. Something about not liking the optics." He winked. "Maybe you can relate." He turned, walking away, waving without looking back. "Try again next quarter. Or the next life." Malcolm remained seated long after Sterling disappeared down the sidewalk, swallowed by a black company car that peeled away without hesitation. He sat still, breath shallow, staring at the plaza tiles in front of him. His coat, once crisp, now wrinkled from the bench's cold edge. His hands, once steady, now trembling not from illness, but rage. Rejection was familiar, but degradation, the kind that drills past skin and into bone, still cut deep, no matter how often it visited. He wasn't angry at Sterling anymore. Sterling was a symptom. The real sickness was deeper, older, etched into the way people's voices changed when they spoke to him. The way elevators became cages, and "please wait here" became another word for "you don't belong." The next morning arrived with surgical precision. Skies over Manhattan clouded in slate, traffic moving like blood through arteries of concrete, and inside the Carradine Group headquarters, tension ran higher than the skyscrapers that loomed outside. Sterling Huxley stood near the central sconce-lit stairwell, coffee in hand, voice smooth as polished mahogany, as he addressed a group of board members with his usual arrogance dressed up as charm. He wore a navy pinstripe suit sharp enough to cut glass, but beneath it he was restless. Something about the silence from the London office last night had left a faint itch at the base of his neck. The quarterly board assembly was scheduled for 9 o'clock sharp. Every division lead, investor liaison, and regional partner had been summoned. Sterling believed the session was nothing more than another self-congratulatory stage for him to reassert dominance. And as he checked his cufflinks in the glass railing's reflection, he murmured to himself with a smile, "Let's put on a show." In the auditorium, the tension was heavy, but unspoken. Rows of suited professionals lined the leather seats, murmurs echoing off the modern stone walls. The air carried the sterile chill of corporate formality, until a tall woman in a deep charcoal blazer stepped onto the stage and adjusted the microphone. It was Evelyn Carr, the firm's global liaison, and the one person Sterling couldn't afford to ignore. She waited for silence, eyes sweeping the room before speaking. "Good morning," she began, voice steady and controlled. "Before we begin our review, I'd like to introduce a special guest who will be joining us not as an observer, but as our new executive partner from Carradine International Holdings." Sterling straightened in his seat, brows slightly drawn. "Executive partner?" Evelyn continued. "As of this week, Carradine's majority equity interest has shifted following an internal acquisition. The individual now holding 71% ownership of Carradine International's global stake is present with us today. Please welcome," she paused, letting the silence stretch, "Mr. Malcolm Thorne." The room froze. A few heads turned toward the back of the room. And then he walked in. Malcolm didn't rush. He didn't posture. He simply moved down the aisle with deliberate poise, dressed in the same charcoal suit from yesterday. Ironed, precise, unflinching. But something had changed. Not the way he walked, but the way people watched him. The silence that had once dripped with mockery was now tight with disbelief. The same men who had laughed at him now sat still, expressions caught between confusion and dawning horror. Sterling rose from his seat, blinking once, then again, as if his brain was refusing to process the scene unraveling in front of him. "This has to be a joke," he muttered to no one in particular. But no one laughed. Malcolm stepped onto the stage, took the microphone from Evelyn, and faced the crowd with the quiet, commanding presence of a man who no longer needed to prove anything. "Yesterday," he began, "I came here not just as a guest, but as a test. Not for me, but for this culture. And it revealed itself exactly as I expected." Sterling stood, interrupting. "You've got to be kidding me," he said loudly. "You. What? You tricked your way into this meeting? Pulled some insider stunt too?" Evelyn turned to him sharply. "Mr. Huxley, please take your seat." Sterling ignored her. "This guy isn't even part of our board. He's an outsider. He's unstable. He owns you," Malcolm said quietly into the mic. The words were a thunderclap in the room. Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "As of this quarter," he continued, "my firm finalized a strategic acquisition through equity transfer. 71% of Carradine International now falls under my governance. And as of this morning, that includes all operating divisions of Carradine Group, its executive appointments, and its compliance authority." Sterling's face went pale. "That's not possible," he said, voice cracking with forced laughter. "That would have required 31 months of silent investment," Malcolm said, meeting his eyes. "6 separate holding groups, and an intricate understanding of how ego blinds oversight." He turned back to the audience. "Yesterday, I was spoken to like a child, mocked for a medical condition, dismissed because of a last name that didn't come with legacy credit. That's not just unprofessional. That's a liability." Evelyn stepped forward again. "Effective immediately," she said. "Malcolm Thorne is the acting executive chairman of the Carradine Group, reporting only to the global board." Malcolm stepped down from the stage to a room so quiet it echoed, the sound of his shoes striking the polished floor a metronome for the collapse of everything Sterling Huxley once controlled. He didn't linger for applause. None was needed. He didn't revel in their stunned faces or the way a few executives glanced nervously at each other, already calculating how quickly to change allegiance. He walked straight through the double doors and into the main lobby, the very same space where 48 hours earlier he'd been dismissed, mocked, and shoved toward irrelevance by a man who now sat powerless. The security guard who once questioned his presence stood taller as he approached, recognizing him instantly, but unsure how to address him now. "Mr. Thorne," the guard said, voice taut with new respect. Malcolm gave a small nod, then turned to the receptionist desk, where the same intern who had once hesitated to greet him now stood frozen behind a screen. "Call a company-wide meeting," Malcolm said calmly. "I want all departments in the lobby in the next 15 minutes. No exceptions." The intern stammered something. He wasn't sure who to check with for that kind of authority. Malcolm leaned in just enough to make eye contact and said, "I am the authority." The intern swallowed hard and began typing. 15 minutes later, the lobby of Carradine Group pulsed with low whispers and unsure stares as employees, assistants, managers, and executives began to file in, lining the railings of the mezzanine, the staircases, the marble floor, where Malcolm now stood alone in the center. Sterling arrived last. He didn't try to hide. He walked in surrounded by a few loyal department heads, jaw clenched, wearing a suit that no longer held power, just memory. The tension in the room wasn't confusion anymore. It was anticipation. And then Malcolm spoke. "Some of you know me," he said, voice even, no microphone needed. "Some of you think you know who I am. 2 days ago, I was told I didn't belong here. Not in this building. Not in this role. Not even in this industry." He paused, letting the memory of Sterling's insults hang unspoken in the air. "I was told I looked like I'd taken a wrong turn. I was given trash to drink from, laughed at, mocked for things I couldn't control." His voice didn't rise, but it cut deeper because of it. "This company talks about meritocracy, about culture, about values, but what I saw was cruelty masquerading as leadership, arrogance camouflaged as tradition, and silence where there should have been integrity." Sterling's jaw flexed, and his eyes burned holes through the floor, but he said nothing. Malcolm continued, "But let's be clear, I didn't come back for revenge. I came to clean house. Because what you tolerate defines you. And for too long, this company has tolerated behavior that destroys more than morale. It destroys people." He pulled a small stack of papers from his coat, holding them up. "Effective immediately," he said. "Sterling Huxley is suspended from all executive functions, pending an internal ethics investigation. He is also barred from entering Carradine property without legal clearance." A collective gasp swept the room. Sterling stepped forward instinctively. "You can't do that," he barked. "You don't have. I have majority equity. I have executive authority. And I have cause," Malcolm said, not looking at him. "You used this space to belittle, to silence, and to harm. And I won't allow it another day." He handed the documents to the building's chief compliance officer, who took them with wide eyes and trembling hands. Sterling's voice dropped, suddenly desperate. "You think this makes you noble? Taking my place like this?" Malcolm turned to him fully now. "No," he said. "I think it makes me necessary." He took a breath, not to calm himself, but to steady the weight of what came next. To those who watched and said nothing, who laughed when it was safe and turned away when it wasn't, your time of comfort is over. This company will be rebuilt, not around egos, but around equity, not around legacy, but around earned leadership. He stepped forward until he stood on the very tile where Sterling had first stopped him at the entrance. 2 days ago, I was called a mistake in this lobby. Today, I'm making corrections." He turned toward the security team. "Escort Mr. Huxley off the premises." The guards hesitated, but when Malcolm nodded, they moved forward. Sterling backed away. "You'll regret this," he said, voice cracking not with anger, but disbelief. "You don't just erase someone like me." Malcolm didn't flinch. "No," he said, "but I can remove you from the equation." There was a moment of stillness, as if everyone was waiting for permission to react. Then, unexpectedly, it began, quietly at first. A voice from the left, hesitant but clear. "He told me I'd never get promoted, because I didn't have the right look." Heads turned. The voice belonged to Camila Estrada, a marketing associate whose name Sterling had never bothered to learn. She wasn't finished. When I asked what he meant, he said, "You don't photograph well. Our clients prefer something more refined." A hush fell again, heavier this time. But then another voice rose, this time from the mezzanine. He called me the quota, said I was lucky HR needed to meet a diversity percentage. That came from Deshaun Hill, a senior analyst. He hadn't spoken much in meetings. Now he stood tall. For 2 years, I thought that was normal, that maybe he was right. I worked harder, stayed later, just to prove I deserved to be here. But I realized now he was scared, not of me failing, but of me succeeding. Gasps and murmurs filled the lobby as more employees spoke, one after another, like dominoes falling, each admission stripping away another layer of Sterling's manufactured image. A woman from accounting shared how she was routinely denied client-facing roles after Sterling questioned her accent in front of a boardroom. A veteran engineer said Sterling once joked that people like him were better suited for security detail than software. Even the junior intern, who just 2 days ago had stumbled through his greeting to Malcolm, stepped forward and said he used to call me Coffee Boy in front of clients. I have a computer science degree, but he never asked. He just assumed. Malcolm didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. The company was purging itself. The walls that once protected Sterling's cruelty were crumbling, not from top-down orders, but from within. What had once been isolated moments of humiliation were now seen for what they truly were: patterns, strategies of dominance cloaked in charm, and decay mistaken for tradition. People who had been silent out of fear were now defiant with clarity. The final blow came when a quiet voice, trembling but firm, cut through the rising clamor. He told me, the speaker said, that I was too black to lead this company. The room stilled. The voice belonged to Naomi Blake, the firm's most senior data executive. She stood at the edge of the mezzanine, hands clasped, face composed but eyes shimmering. He said I could run the numbers, but never the room. That leadership was about legacy, and mine was invisible. Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't stop. For years, I believed him. I let him shrink me. I let myself fade. But seeing Malcolm stand where he stands now, I know I'm not invisible, and I never was. Tears filled a few eyes. Even among the senior board, postures softened, gazes dropped. No one rushed to defend Sterling. No one tried to justify. The silence that followed wasn't just shame, it was awakening. Malcolm stepped forward again, voice steady. This is not a witch hunt. It's a reckoning. What you've shared today doesn't just speak to one man's failure. It speaks to what we allowed. And starting now, that ends. He lifted the final paper in his folder. Every complaint filed against Mr. Huxley, every dismissed HR report, every ignored concern, will be reviewed under the oversight of an external ethics committee. Retroactively, transparently, thoroughly. A wave of relief swept the room. It wasn't just justice, it was validation. By the end of the week, Sterling Huxley's name had become radioactive. News of his suspension traveled faster than any press release Carradine Group ever published. Major outlets ran the story under headlines like Power Meets Reckoning, and CEO brought down by his own culture. But it wasn't the headline that destroyed him, it was the silence that followed. Calls went unanswered. Emails bounced back with polite deferrals. Sterling tried reaching out to former allies, but suddenly everyone was busy, unavailable, traveling. Investors who once wined and dined him now referred inquiries to legal. The board didn't just distance itself from him, it erased him. By Monday, his company ID had been deactivated. By Wednesday, the firm quietly removed his name from all historical documentation. A week after that, Sterling stood outside the glass doors of the building he once ruled, dressed in the same $1,000 suit that no longer opened a single one of them. No one came to greet him. No one met his eyes. He wasn't escorted out this time. He was ignored into oblivion. But the reckoning didn't stop there. The firm's internal audit, now led by an outside compliance board appointed by Malcolm himself, began digging deeper. HR files long buried under red tape were unearthed. Complaints marked resolved, with no action, were reopened. Names and stories began surfacing. A full list of employees affected by discriminatory practices was compiled and presented to Malcolm's office by Friday. He didn't just review it. He knew every line, every case, every name. And then he did something no one expected. He picked up the phone. Over the next 48 hours, over a dozen former employees who had resigned under Sterling's regime received personal calls from Malcolm Thorne. Some cried. Some didn't believe it was real. But every one of them heard the same sentence: "We failed you once. We won't do it again." The following month, Malcolm held his first press conference, not to speak about his acquisition, not to gloat about his authority, but to announce the creation of a new program called the Thorne Fellowship. It was a multi-million-dollar initiative designed to identify and fund professionals who had been systematically denied opportunities due to race, disability, or background. Talent, Malcolm said before a crowd of over 200 reporters, is not defined by pedigree. It's defined by perseverance. And too often, we've rewarded the loudest voices, not the strongest character. The room erupted in applause, but not everyone was clapping from the seats. A live feed broadcasted across the nation showed viewers Sterling couldn't escape. He watched from a small apartment uptown, alone, television volume turned low, eyes locked on the screen. His face bore the weight of a man who finally understood he hadn't lost his power. He had never truly possessed it. All he'd ever held was fear, and now that was gone. Within Carradine Group, change wasn't just promised, it was enforced. Hiring committees were restructured, promotion panels diversified, anonymous reporting systems were redesigned with external oversight. And in the heart of it all stood Malcolm, not as a figurehead, but as a daily presence. He walked the halls that once excluded him, not to assert superiority, but to remain accountable. His tremor hadn't gone away. His hand still shook some mornings. But now, no one looked at that and saw weakness. They saw strength that refused to disguise itself. One evening, after a long strategy session with department heads, Malcolm paused outside the same lobby bench where he'd once waited in the cold, dismissed and forgotten. A junior analyst passed by and hesitated, then spoke. "Sir," she said softly, "I was here that day. I saw what they did to you. I didn't speak up. I regret that every day." Malcolm turned, meeting her eyes, not with judgment, but with understanding. "Then don't waste the regret," he replied. "Use your voice next time, for yourself and for someone else." She nodded slowly, a little straighter now, and walked away with a different kind of posture. That was the win Malcolm wanted. Not applause, not headlines, just a quiet shift in how people saw themselves. As the city lights flickered on outside and the lobby emptied into silence, Malcolm stood alone, no longer the outsider, no longer the man waiting for permission. He was the voice they tried to bury, the name they underestimated, the face they tried to erase. And now, he was the one writing the ending. The end. If you found this story powerful, consider subscribing for more narratives that challenge injustice and celebrate redemption. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What moment hit you the hardest? Which part made you pause, reflect, or even feel seen? And where in the world are you watching or reading from? Drop a comment below, and let's keep the conversation going. Your voice matters here.